Good evening. I'm Charles Payne, sitting in for Mike Perry, the director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. On behalf of Mike and all of us here at the foundation, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's presentation by Mr. Aden Magee, who has a presentation for us tonight on military liaison missions in Europe. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Magee.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Yeah, good evening, everybody. My name is Aden Magee, and by way of background, I'm a retired military intelligence officer, U.S. Army, and 10 of my years that I spent on active duty were spent in Europe. 5 of those were spent during the final 5 years of the Cold War, and my position was I was the commander of a counterintelligence unit that was responsible for counterintelligence coverage, among other things, of the Soviet military liaison mission in Frankfurt. So as you may discern, I had a story that to tell, and about 5 years ago, I started to go through the process of getting items declassified to begin writing the book. But as I realized when I started writing my piece of the book, there was a much larger operational and strategic context that I had to place it under. So you would have liked to have thought that I could just go to Amazon and look for the best rated book on the USMLMs, but they simply didn't exist. In fact, the only books that did exist were kind of parochial treatments by officers who were assigned to the missions for 2 or 3 years, but nothing that really gave it a strong historical context. So that's why I went through the research, and I would consider myself kind of the accidental expert on the MLMs now, because I can assure you that the research and the documentation that I've provided on the MLMs is as extensive as you'll be able to find out there, and that's why the foundation center has asked me to provide this briefing this evening for you. So if there is anything else, Bruce, we can get started.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go to slide 1, and I'll just jump right into it, or slide 2 rather.
All right.
Okay, so as the war in Germany, World War II, was coming to a conclusion, the 4 Allied powers, the US, the Brits, the French, and the Soviets, got together to discuss how they were going to begin administering Germany once we received their unconditional surrender. And what they came to was the agreement on control machinery in Germany for how they would administer the post-war Germany. And one of the articles of that agreement was that it seemed prudent that each of the commands would have accredited to it a liaison element from each of the other commands to communicate amongst the commands to help the administration of Germany. So after the war was over, then the first meeting of the Allied partners after that took place as the Potsdam Agreement, and they decided to implement the protocols of the control machinery in Germany. Next slide, please. So this is just the overview of how the Allies divided to split up the Germany for occupation purposes. And again, these were considered to be just administrative areas where they would coordinate the real rebuilding and reintegration of Germany into the international community. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner is how they divided the city of Berlin. Next slide. Okay, so almost immediately off the bat, the Soviets began causing trouble, and there was a lack of cooperation in how we were going to begin to rebuild Germany. And really, so now we referred to the Allied partners as France, Britain, and Germany, and then there were the Soviets in their zone, and they managed things differently. And so to counter kind of the Soviet belligerence, the 3 Allies then consolidated their zone into one area. So it was basically one consolidated Western zone, and then the Eastern zone, which became known as East Germany. And this is where the divide, the schism between the two really began. Next slide. And then, once the Germans or the Soviets implemented the Berlin blockade, then all the protocols of the agreement for control machinery in Germany had essentially broken down altogether. But all the Allies and the Soviets did agree that it would make sense, given the confusion and the uncertainty and the possibility of some type of a strategic miscalculation, that they should at least enact Article 2 of the agreement, so that there was a means of communication, a channel of communication between each of the headquarters, so they could make sure, again, that there was not some type of a strategic miscalculation. So in 1947, the Americans and the Soviets enacted the Huebner-Malinin Agreement, which is the name of the two deputy sinks for USSR and the Soviet Group of Forces Germany, who signed the agreement. And what this did was it established the U.S. military liaison mission in Potsdam, where the Group of Soviet Forces Germany was located, and established the Soviet military liaison mission in Frankfurt, where then the headquarters EUCOM was located. And also that year, the French and the Brits executed similar agreements with the Soviets. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the main developments that occur, again, there's a lack of cooperation between the Soviets and the Allies. It's just continuing at this point. So, and again, in the light of this belligerence, the Allies further took their consolidated zone and just established it as the Federal Republic of Germany, and gave them some sovereign rights to begin to administer themselves political. Now, we still remained an occupying power, but we did give them some sovereign rights, and one of them was that they were able to enact their own constitution, which was referred to as the Basic Law. And this is kind of key through the history of the MLMs, because one of the key principles of the Basic Law was that their vision was that at some point, all of the former republic or former territories of Germany would one day be reunified into a unified Germany. So this was always their vision. And, you know, part of that vision was the fact that the protocols that govern the machineries in Germany kind of stayed together. And at that point, Article 2 and those MLMs were really the only remaining vestige of that agreement that remained in place. So that's kind of what they tied themselves to as the only symbol that the international community still wanted Germany to become a reunified power. Next slide. Okay, so within the Huebner-Malinin Agreement, again, it was written kind of initially to be a protocol for how we would conduct liaison. So there were provisions specified that there would be 14 personnel, 10 vehicles, how logistical support would be established. But there was one provision in the agreement that really set the game of cat and mouse that took place over the next 43 years in place. And that was the provision, next slide, please, kind of ambiguous, that specified that the MLMs would have freedom of travel throughout each other's sector without any escort or supervision, except places of disposition of military units. But the agreement didn't further qualify what they meant by disposition of military units. So all sides immediately took that as the charter to freely move throughout each other's countryside and collect intelligence on their heavily fortified fronts in that what would be a decisive area of Central Europe. So each of the MLMs became basically immediately intelligence collection efforts. Next slide. And there were some additional agreements that were put in place that the MLM personnel would wear uniforms when off the compound. They would have special license plates on their vehicles. And while this served kind of a counterintelligence and security purpose, it also signified the special status that the MLMs had in their sectors of occupied Germany. Next slide. Okay, and as you can see, even though the MLMs were ostensibly created to be a liaison element, you can see this is from one of their very first annual reports. They had their primary and unclassified mission as being able to conduct military liaison, but you can see their secondary and classified, and don't be concerned with that, these are all declassified documents at this point, was to conduct intelligence operations. And they even established kind of terms of the art or protocols, so they didn't have to use those nasty words like intelligence collection. They referred to their intelligence collection operations, which were essentially vehicle-borne reconnaissance missions, as tours. And they even referred to their officers and NCOs as tour NCOs and tour officers. So they didn't have to kind of, you know, actually use the terms intelligence collection, even though everybody knew that's exactly what they were out doing. And it within in the USLMM was one of the most prolific intelligence collection elements within the DoD from the beginning through the end. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, they were given the freedom to move throughout, but there was that qualifying statement, except in locations of military disposition, which were not further defined in the article. So the Soviets were the first in 1951 to try to put some type of a cooperative norm in to define what would those areas be. So they that year issued the first permanently restricted area map. And as you can see from the graphic, that was a map of their sector, East Germany, with shaded areas, which depicted the locations where the MLMs were not allowed to move into and collect. And so their first graphic that they provided was covered about 39% of the country. So of course the Allies in kind, they reciprocated by issuing their PRA maps, and that was kind of the cooperative norm that was established. Also, a few times a year, they would each issue what were referred to as temporary restricted area maps, and these would have shaded areas that would last for 3 to 30 days restrictions. Generally, these were locations where there were major training exercises taking place, or they were bringing in new modified equipment that they didn't want to see being taken off the railhead or things like that. The other thing that I will add is that in the Soviet section, they also had what they referred to as the MLM restriction signs. And you can see there's an example of that. It was in all 4 languages, which were put in place specifically for the MLMs. And these were, however, not agreed to by the Allies. They stated that they didn't fall under the parameters of the Huebner-Malinin Agreement, and Soviets did not enforce them as such. Now, even though the East German and the Soviet forces, they would try to enforce them as though they were had the same strength as the PRA maps. In reality, if a USMLM officer were found to be violating a PRA, the chances are he would have his accreditation papers taken from him, and he would be PNG'd out of the country. Whereas if an officer were found to be violating a MRS, the Soviets knew that that was not binding under the agreement and would never take such action. So even the Soviets did see the difference in those 2 types of restrictions. Next slide. And I know a lot of this is kind of deep in the weeds background stuff, but I think that it's important. But as we look at the trajectory that both the USMLM and the Soviet military liaison mission took from that point, the real big difference in how they developed, and it was a big difference, was the USMLM base of operations. They were located in Potsdam, East Germany, a very repressive, a very depressed kind of location to operate out of. We're right across the river. You had all the amenities of West Berlin. That's where the families were. So very quickly they realized it was in their best operational interest to establish a base of operations in West Berlin to really operate out of. And then when they would launch tours into East Germany, they would go by the Potsdam House for kind of the symbolic notion of being able to launch the tour out of there. But they were basically operating out of their rear base in West Berlin. And what this gave them the opportunity to do was to build a very robust organization, up to 70 personnel, on top of the 14 accredited individuals they had. So what they were able to do were rotate tour officers, tour NCOs, to, fresh teams in and out of East Germany for intelligence collection missions. And so they were able to maintain a very high op tempo by using this base. And they also had a very robust intelligence analysis and production element, very robust photographic lab element and such. By about 1950, however, the Soviet group of forces, Germany, had moved out of Potsdam and moved down to Wunsdorf, about 30 miles down the road. And this became known as Little Moscow. This was basically a Soviet enclave in East Germany, not the kind of place that you would want to have your operating base or your headquarters. So they stayed in Potsdam. So since they were kind of dislocated from the headquarters, the Soviets established the Soviet External Relations Bureau in Potsdam, which was essentially the day-to-day communications between the USMLM and the Soviet group of forces, Germany. Next slide. Okay, in contrast to what we saw develop in West Germany, SMLM-F had this kind of small compound, and it was in just plush downtown real estate, high-end real estate in downtown Frankfurt. It was for the Germans. It was kind of a stain on their society to have this kind of World War II-ish looking complex with English and Soviet writing on it in the middle of one of their top-end neighborhoods within Frankfurt. So it was kind of sat poorly with them, but it was what it was. But you can see that unlike the Potsdam location where they were right across the river from their support base, SMLM-F, the Soviet Military Liaison Mission Frankfurt, was basically on an island in Frankfurt. They were far away from the border, and the Soviets didn't try to arrange any type of similar operation where they would have cross-border support. So it was basically just their 14 personnel operating out of that location. Kind of like the Soviet group of forces in 1952, headquarters UCOM gave headquarters USAR, U.S. Army Europe, all responsibility for operations in Europe. And this included the Huebner-Malinin Agreement and management of the Soviet military liaison mission in Frankfurt. However, even though the headquarters then moved to Heidelberg, for whatever reason, the Soviets never moved their mission from Frankfurt to Heidelberg. So they remained about 60 miles away from the headquarters that they were established to maintain liaison with. So like the USMLM, the USAR established the Allied Contact Section in Frankfurt, which was the day-to-day interface with the Soviet military liaison mission in Frankfurt. And keep in mind, there's also a Soviet military liaison mission in the British sector, and there's also a Soviet military liaison mission in the French sector of West Germany. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we start talking kind of about the operational environment, there were things that took place in both sectors. More so, the East German sector was much more active than the West German sector, but there were incidents and things that took place. Surveillance was conducted by both sides, much more so by the East German Security Service, the Stasi. Detentions were just as the term would denote. It was the efforts on one of the two sides to catch a MLM vehicle, ideally penetrating a permanently restricted area so they could catch them red-handed in the act. But detentions were basically a competitive norm that were exercised by both sides and were accepted, but they were definitely exercised much more so by the East Germans and the Soviets in the Eastern sector. And then there were other things that were very unique to the Eastern sector, which were rammings and shootings, which never took place in the USAR sector, but were common in the U.S. sector by both the Germans and the Soviets. But the key thing here is just that these incidents took place. There were rammings, there were vehicle shootings, and since the Huebner-Malinin Agreement technically had standing as a international agreement, anything that was allowed to kind of happen under the context of that agreement, if it was allowed to continue to happen, it was basically accepted legal precedent. So the fact that USAR allowed these things to continue to happen, even though they protested them in the strongest terms, they never said, okay, these are a deal breaker. If there's another shooting, we're going to shut down the mission if there's another ramming. So this kind of it demonstrates the degree of risk that the U.S. was willing to accept to keep this very vital intelligence collection mission collecting. And so, for example, and we're going to get to a couple of the casualties that took place during the MLM period, but the officer standing by that vehicle waiting to have a detention resolved is Major Nick Nicholson, and we'll speak about him in a few minutes. And then the vehicle there you see in the middle is a French MLM vehicle, and that was the first MLM casualty. It was rammed by a East German gas truck in 1984, and the French officer was killed. And years later, Stasi files after the end of the Cold War, Stasi files were released, which demonstrated that this, in fact, was an intentional act. This was a intentional campaign of vehicle rammings, and they picked this one specific French military liaison officer because he had been particularly aggressive in his intelligence collection activities. Now, I don't think they intended to kill him, but they did want to send a message, and they certainly did. So next slide. Okay, so I'll just touch on this very quickly, but you know, the MLMs did enjoy what we would call quasi-diplomatic immunity, even though the provision didn't give them full diplomatic immunity. The way the East Germans and the West Germans treated them was as though they had diplomatic immunity, except in those cases where the East Germans thought that the MLMs were getting too close to sensitive military activities, and then they would do the a detention attempt or the ramming or things like that. But generally speaking, they both enjoyed military diplomatic immunity. In fact, the more extreme cases are actually in the USMLM side of the pond, where there were members that were involved in accidents and actually hitting pedestrians, things like that, that if a East German citizen had done, they would have been arrested immediately and put on trial. But the MLM members were able to just have their accreditation taken away from them, sent out of country, just like a diplomat would, having diplomatic immunity and then being expelled from a country after a crime. So they did enjoy that degree of luxury. And it all had to do with being an occupying power in a post-war Germany. Next slide. So when we talk about the differences in the Soviet military liaison mission in Frankfurt and the USMLMs and the other MLMs for that matter, operating in East Germany, a lot of the the way they did business had to do with the operational environment. In East Germany, you know, they had a large amount of the main Soviet forward deployed force was located right there on that heavily enforced central front. There were the 20 divisions, the German division. So essentially the entire sector was one big training and maneuver area. Whereas in the US sector, we tended to kind of respect the German sovereignty. And so most of the training the US did, with the exception of the one larger forger exercise every year, was contain their training activities to the garrison locations or one of the three primary training ranges, two of which were in the US sector. So if there was really any training that was going on of any interest, it was happening on those training sites which were deep within permanently restricted areas when the Soviets couldn't get to there. So they didn't have nearly the opportunities to collect on ongoing operations in West Germany the way that USMLM did in East Germany. Next slide. And this kind of, you know, whether it was the chicken or the egg, this kind of gets to the more aggressive mentality of the USMLM operating in their areas. Again, the stuff that they were going to look at, they were going to collect on, wasn't taking place on the Autobahns and the open roads of East Germany. It was taking place along the countryside. And so they configured their vehicles to be able to perform those type of, armored reconnaissance intelligence collection missions throughout the countryside. So you can see all these modifications were basically to enable them to do just that. Next slide. One of the some of the more interesting modifications to the vehicles. You can see that all the vehicles that the U.S. military liaison mission tours drove, they had modifications to their lights, and they had a number of switches on the dashboard to manipulate these. And I'll bring your attention to switch number 4. You could see that they could kill the brake lights. So if there was a vehicle traveling in front of a potential surveillance vehicle, they could kill the brake lights so the vehicle would not see that they were getting ready to slow down and make a quick turn off the road. If you look at switch number 6, they were able to kill the lights and make it appear at night as though the vehicle had the profile of a motorcycle. So if USMLM vehicle was traveling and they thought they had surveillance behind them, they could go around the blind turn. And once they saw they had temporarily lost their surveillance, they could turn off the profile, make it look like it was a motorcycle. And when the Stasi surveillance vehicle came out of the blind turn, it would look like the USMLM vehicle was gone and there's only a motorcycle up there. So they needed to, so that told them that they must have turned off somewhere and they would turn off looking for them. So kind of the games that these guys play. Next slide. Okay, so this, I mean, the numbers are kind of hard to get your head around, but the bottom line is USMLM was a touring and intelligence collection machine. They conducted tours ranging from 2 to 3 to 4 days. They had multiple tours, either 2 to 4 simultaneous tours out collecting at any given time. So if you look at the bottom line there, that roughly 900 tour days per year, that tells you that any given time, there were 2.5 tours, 2 to 3 tours out at any given time. And so during the course of the 42 years, there were 2 very brief periods where there was kind of a pause in touring. But besides that, this was an activity that was going on in East Germany 24/7, 364 days a year for 42 years. So you can see that is a pretty high op tempo and a pretty impressive rate of operations that they maintained for that entire year consistently. And that gets to why, next slide, they were among the very most prolific intelligence collection elements in the DoD. In fact, they were probably only third to the National Security Agency, NSA, and the Joint Interrogation and Debriefing apparatus that operated in Germany as far as the amount of IARs, but as opposed to SIGINT from NSA and the debriefings of, kind of sources of dubious credibility, the USMLM collection, this was firsthand, eyes-on observation. And you can see the number of intelligence reports per year is pretty staggering as far as, so you can see why they were so esteemed as a intelligence collection element. And they basically had a legacy that they formed early on, and they carried it with them. President Eisenhower regularly cited how important the USMLM reporting was and the insights that it was giving. And then U.S. leaders throughout and the defense intelligence agencies always relied heavily on the USMLM reporting, again, for the only source of firsthand eyes-on intelligence on the Soviet group forces, Germany, and the East German forces at the time. Next slide. Okay, and there was a great deal of cooperation. Again, there were 3 MLMs operating in the Soviet sector. So to put that in perspective, when the agreements were signed, it looked at all 4 of the allies as equal. But then once it kind of became 3 against 1, so now the Soviets, they have 1 MLM that's operating in each of their sectors, the British, French, and the American. But all of the allied MLMs have their MLMs operating in the 1 Soviet sector. So they're basically saturating the sector with intelligence. The British were just about as aggressive as the US, the French not as much so, but still there was a large degree of collection that was taking place in addition to what USMLM did. So the Allies split up the area into 3 primary zones. They would give each take 1 zone for 2 weeks. So there was a high degree of coordination among the allies. So the amount of collection that was taking place in that sector was pretty significant. Next slide. And the Soviet counterintelligence and security apparatus was also pretty extensive. You just kind of look at the numbers. You know that the East Germany was a police state, so there was the MLMs could not operate on the roads without multiple reports being called into the Stasis to focus their surveillance apparatus. And next slide, and they did have a very nationally orchestrated counterintelligence effort with surveillance coverage of the MLMs. So they saw the MLMs as their most immediate and recognizable risk through the street, and they took it very seriously, and they put a lot of assets against them. But then in the end, the East German surveillance was really just little more than an irritant to the USMLM personnel, because they were driving these high performance vehicles that could go off-road anytime. So generally, whenever the tour officer decided it was time to lose their Stasi surveillance, they just tell the NCO to floor it, get up to 140 miles an hour on the Autobahn, and at the time of their choosing to kill the lights, go off the road, watch the Stasi vehicles pass by, and then they either stay there, or if it's after dark, they go into no light driving mode with IR and night vision goggles on, go to wherever the collection activity was going to take place the next day, get a couple of hours sleep, and then be ready to collect. So that was their standard way of doing business. And again, when they wanted to lose their surveillance, they were pretty effective at doing that because they had that off-road capability. Next slide. Okay, the SMLM-F Touring, in contrast to USMLM by the time, to USMLM. We talked about the different target environments, and that probably had a lot to do with the way that they toured. By the time they got to the 60s and 70s and 80s, they really were only touring maybe once a day, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And again, basically all they could do was get on the Audubon, look at what convoys were heading into the training areas, which ones were leaving the training areas. And this is information that they could probably, they were able to get by just picking up the Stars and Stripes magazine at the Frankfurt PX every day. So again, they were, in comparison to the USMLMs, they were very benign as far as their touring activities. The drivers rarely left the vehicles to go on foot reconnaissance, things like that. So a very diametric model for the SMLM-F as compared to the USMLM. Next slide. And some of you who were there during the day will probably remember some of this. The US USER did have a effective SMLM-F monitoring process. We had the sighting program, and we were pretty effective. And there you see we also had a CI element, that is the one that I commanded, that would do some limited surveillance of SMLM-F. But the reality of it is the way that SMLM-F did their operations, we would get as good of an idea of what SMLM-F was doing on any given day touring as through surveillance as we would through the sighting center, or I should say we'd get as good through the sighting center as we would surveillance. So we had a pretty effective way of pretty much well determining on a given day's basis what their intelligence targets might have been and where they were. And I'll just note that, from the USMLM or SMLM-F perspective, USER never asked the West German government to surveil them or provide any other type of CI coverage. And this started first as kind of a occupying power thing. But then after USER saw the way that the East Germans were kind of getting out of control, they didn't want to take the chance of the West Germans doing anything that would cause the Soviets to reciprocate against USMLM, because USER was all about the effectiveness of the USMLM mission, and they didn't want to see anything happen in the U.S. sector that would impact the effectiveness of that collection mission. And in the same light, the USER never let the CIA provide any support. Since it was a military agreement, it was not under the State Department purview. So USER was able to tell the CIA to stay away, which they didn't until a few operations in the early 80s. Next slide. And here's what the card that will probably bring up a few old memories for those of us who were there during the day is the SMLM sighting and detention card, which every soldier received the training annually, and they were supposed to have this card in their cargo pocket or their wallet anywhere that they went. And it basically told them what the procedures were for detentions. But in reality, as we found in USER, there really to detain a SMLM-F vehicle, there really wasn't a lot of reward in it, and it wasn't really heavily emphasized by USER. And the main reason being is because if you detain a SMLM-F vehicle somewhere in Germany, then you're going to tie up resources that have to stay there. It's the commander's responsibility to make sure that nothing happens to the officers. So, it was a long, drawn-out process, and it became to be kind of understood that it really wasn't worth the reward. And USER also didn't really encourage it too much, because they knew that anytime there was a detention of a SMLM-F vehicle in West Germany, within the next 3 days, there was going to be a very aggressive, perhaps even violent detention of USMLM in East Germany. And so it became kind of known that the benefit of a detention in the SMLM-F zone was not worth the negative impact that it had on USMLM collection activities. So they really were not advertised or enforced very strictly. And as you can see, on the card, there were a lot more do nots than do's, which would kind of favor against action as well. So next slide. Okay, so we've gone through kind of the compare and contrast, but the bottom line that we get to there is, the question that came to everybody's mind, certainly by the 1980s, was that the Soviets, who would always overmatch the U.S. and the West when it came to UMINT and counterintelligence capability, why was it that they would allow this degree of disparity, where we were running roughshod over East Germany and they were only touring, one time a day, 5 days a week? What was it that made them want to allow that dynamic to continue. And so that was one of the kind of great questions that persisted. But in USAR's mind, as long as the Soviets remained a relatively benign threat and we were able to continue that intelligence collection mission in East Germany, then that was okay, because everybody loved that intel that USMLM was collecting. Next slide. Okay, and you know, for a lot of people who didn't spend time in the in Cold War, you know, you might think that the 80s was kind of the last decade of the Cold War. Things were actually starting to ramp down, but for those of us that were there, they know that it was the opposite. Those were the most turbulent times of the Cold War, particularly the first 5 years of the 80s were really the tense years, and those are the 2 years where, as we alluded to, the first MLM officer was killed in a vehicle ramming. That was the French officer in March of '84. And then the following year, a USMLM officer was shot and killed by a Soviet sentry. Next slide. So Major Nick Nicholson was the first KIA of the MLMs. This occurred again in 1985. He and his tour officer, Sergeant Schatz, were out. They saw some tanks returning from training, as they always were. You know, there was a competition to see who could find the tanks that had the latest modifications on them. So they went to a tank shed location. Nicholson dismounted the vehicle, was snooping around. As they always did, the driver stayed in the vehicle. He had his sunroof up. He was standing, looking around. A Soviet sentry came out of the wood line, shot a shot that went by Statz's head. Major Nicholson turned from the sentry and began running back to the vehicle. 2 shots were fired. One went through a vital organ, and he bled out on the ground. And the sentry refused to let the NCO give Nicholson any medical treatment. And this was one of the more high-profile events, obviously, of the MLM era, but still, the US and the Soviets knew or felt that it was in their best interest to kind of keep it as low-key as they possibly could, because some people might start wondering, you know, why are these post-World War II relics still around and still allowed to operate on what should be considered, you know, sovereign countries? Next slide. Okay, so Nicholson was posthumously promoted. He's considered the last casualty of the Cold War. Really, there were other casualties, so he was technically the last KIA. But and USAR, based on this, they demanded a series of negotiations. Next slide. I'm going to have to start dropping a few slides on the floor due to the time, but I won't go through this. But there's a long history within USAR of looking at the Soviet shooting incidents, wanting to protest, but really realizing that the Soviets had a pretty good argument. I mean, the USMLM officers were creeping around through the woods in battle dress uniforms, and the Soviets always contended that the sentry had the responsibility to guard his post against an unknown intruder. And you know, USAR studied the problem a number of times and realized that they really didn't have a strong argument for why that shouldn't be the case. And so that's why, again, it kind of became an acceptable norm under legal precedents up to and through the Nicholson event. Next slide. And this just gives you kind of an idea. The Nicholson shooting was certainly not an isolated incident. When you look at the 35 shootings leading up to the Nicholson event, you know, basically averaged 1 a year. 75% of those were aimed shots. So you can see that for a long time, USAR accepted this risk to its personnel, but it thought that the intelligence collection mission was that important. And again, that was kind of the mentality of the time. And if you take a look at the lower box there, you can see that even the USMLM commander in his historic report kind of tried to downplay the risk by saying that, you know, out of the 5 shooting incidents, well, only 1 actually hit the vehicle. So 20%, that's not too bad. So that's okay. But that was, again, that was kind of the mentality that they wanted to accept that risk because they believed the intelligence collection mission was just that vital. And maybe it was. Next slide. Okay, so the Nicholson shooting began a series of negotiations. I mean, this, if you have the opportunity, there's a 400-page report on this put out by the USAR Legal Office, and it is a pretty compelling, interesting read. I won't get into all the details, but basically it became very apparent from the beginning of the negotiations that the Soviets were going to stand by their pre-approved Politburo talking points and not concede on any of the issues. So really, the U.S. did not get any of the concessions that they wanted. Next slide. Okay, but the few things that they did get was the Soviets agreed to put out an instruction card to their troops, although it still, as a poke in the eye to USFR, still said that a sentry had the right to guard his post by any means possible. And then the other, what they referred to as a success, was historically the Soviet sector had about a 39% average of PRAs throughout the sector restricted areas, and the Allies tried to keep theirs around 25 as an incentive to get the Soviets to reduce theirs. So they were able to do this. But during this negotiation period, for whatever reason, the Soviets decided that they would capitulate and finally go down to the lowest average of collective PRAs, which substantially increased the USMLM's collection access. So they saw this as a big success, and it was the only real success of the entire Nicholson negotiation. Next slide. Okay, so some of you may have heard, I won't go into great detail here, but many, when the spy James Hall was arrested in 1988 and debriefed in 1989, he admitted that he had compromised some USMLM photos of one of their real intelligence coups, which were New Year's Eve photos inside of a modified T-64 tank. And so there was some supposition that the Soviets were upset about this. They put admonitions out to the troops, and that was and James even said that he felt that Hall even said that he felt that he was responsible for the shooting. But in reality, next slide, we didn't see any activity on the ground that would indicate that there was an uptick in security. And in reality, the Soviets would not compromise one of its most consequential assets just to improve poor OPSEC out in the field. So I am among those who do not think that this incident and the Hall arrest had anything to do with the Nicholson shooting. Next slide. Okay. And so this gets into kind of the other part of the story, which we won't have time for tonight. But in the SMLM or the USMLM history report, you can see there are a number of anomalies that they cited, and one of them was the Soviets' real compulsion with not really improving their collection access and near the training areas, but having greater access to the larger urban areas, to include Frankfurt, Baden-Baden. So this was kind of the anomaly that we found out of the negotiations. Was that they were more concerned with access to urban areas than they were with anything else. Next slide. Okay, and so the confirmation to why they may have been a little more interested in access to urban areas started to slowly come out as as we got into the 80s. There was a high-level GRU defector to the Brits who began to provide information about the Soviet MLMs in Germany, and he referred to them offhandedly as Soviet residencies, meaning they were GRU clandestine UMET residencies. And he even talked about two incidents where an Army officer and then an Army NCO walked into a MLM and provided classified information for pay. There was another event where a escaped Stasi agent made his way to the French MLM, and they smuggled him out of the country. And then one of the most credible sources that we ever had, which was Gordievsky, who was the guy who, for those of you who are familiar, provided insights regarding how seriously the Soviets were taking the Able Archer exercises is an indication of nuclear war. And that really was the closest we ever did come to nuclear war with the Soviets. So this guy was a very credible agent. And after he was forced to defect, after Aldrich Ames compromised him, he provided some more information on the fact that, yeah, the GRU, like any forward presence that the Soviets had during anywhere worldwide, they always operated clandestine, covert GRU and KGB operations out of those. So why wouldn't they do that out of their three residencies they have right there in the center of the Central Front for the next big war? So it started to become obvious of why perhaps SMLM-F wasn't as aggressive as far as their touring activity were concerned, and maybe they might have been up to some other things, and why the Soviets maybe allowed that disparity to continue to take place, because they were getting some type of benefit out of the Soviets present, but just wasn't the kind of benefit that we were getting. Next slide. Okay, and I think that we're coming to the conclusion, but of course, right now, we don't have any of the answers because myself and others have tried to get those answers, and there's that persistent firewall. The Soviets will never get the true answer to what they were up to, and well, at least we haven't so far, and we may never get the true answer. But there is much evidence to suggest that the SMLM-F was a clandestine GRU residency operating out of in Europe, and because we kind of perceived that they were perhaps should be operating like us, we didn't look at them from that perspective, and we didn't pull some of the right people in, like the CIA and like the German counterintelligence, who might have been able to give us some of that support and that perspective regarding what they might have really been up to. And next slide. Okay, and then of course the real telling issue is what the Soviets really knew during that time. Particularly when you look at the George Trofimov, he was the chief of the Army debriefing facility out of Nuremberg. They had access to all the USMLM reporting, of course, because they needed to confirm the information they were getting. Clyde Conrad, he's the guy that compromised in 1985 the NATO plan. That as soon as it was released, it was on the shelf in Moscow, and his network got $50,000 for that plan, and that told the Soviets where all of our go to war locations were, where all of our forward nuclear locations would be. So they basically knew what the plan. So those two sources alone, the Soviets got more from these guys than they could have ever gotten from the most aggressive SMLM-F collection in West Germany during the previous 30, 40 years. And then again, Hall, he was another big one who compromised not only USMLM information, but he really was the one who probably gave the Soviets what would have been the decisive advantage. I won't go into details now with their Project Trojan, but that was the Soviets had a decisive advantage in armored forces, and this was the capability through identifying signatures within each of the armor divisions to identify where they are, what they were doing, that we thought was going to be our equalizer in the event of the war. Little did we know this had been compromised by Hall to the Soviets, and they had already implemented countermeasures for that. So really, based on Hall and Conrad alone, they really gave the decisive advantage to the Soviets. So again, not only were they aware of what the USMLM was reporting, but they were also providing information that could not have been equaled by SMLM-F. So that kind of solves some of the mysteries there as well. Next slide. Here in just a second, so I'll go ahead and preempt what we know is the would be the next one. Is, did their legacy make a difference? And it certainly did from the standpoint of intelligence collection. Despite the compromises, they were viewed as one of the most prolific intelligence collection efforts ever, and they made a big impact in that regard. Also, you've got to agree that they were a strong confidence building and crisis prevention measure throughout the Cold War. It did show that on a number of areas, the Soviets and the U.S. were cooperating, and most historians don't even know that there was this stable and consistent channel of communication. And in my personal view, however, some people say, well, they were a strong indicator. They would have told us if the Soviets were getting ready to go to war, because they would have closed them down. But we kind of know from the Soviet war plans that were compromised in 1960 and otherwise, the Soviets, their plan was to be to the English Channel within 72 to 96 hours. Folks that were in the missions there, they were considered collateral damage, or perhaps they had go-to-ground missions like, our Dead A, which was Special Force Dead A, had in Berlin. And, we considered the Berlin Brigade the speed bump. So we didn't think that the Soviets were really going to give us any kind of ambiguous warning. And certainly the MLMs, what they did was not going to give us any type of indication. But I will, next slide, and this is my final slide. But the real legacy that they made, as I alluded to at the beginning, was that of all the articles of machine control machinery in Germany, the Potsdam Agreement, the MLMs were the only vestige, that Article 2 that endured through the entire Cold War. And this is what the Germans finally were able to hang their hat on and say, this is the international community supporting us in unified Germany. And that's why the MLMs their last day of operations was 2 October 1990, which was the day before the reunification of Germany. So that was the kind of what I would consider their true legacy, is they were that lineage of occupation of Germany, which eventually helped to result in their reunification. And that concludes the formal portion of the briefing.
Mr. McKee, thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. My first question for you is this. To your understanding, to your awareness, what was the reaction of East German civilians that would observe our MLM personnel? If you could talk to that a moment about any encounters, anything that you're aware of, either pro or con. Positive.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a mixed bag. Now, of course, any of the East German citizens, if they weren't a spy or an informant for the Stasi, they had to be concerned that somebody was going to tell on them. So the tendency would be to not cooperate. But there are a number of times throughout the years, the MLMs would always carry their little petty cash fund around with them if they had an accident. There were a number of instances where they would pay off the East German not to report it. Number of times when they would get stuck, their vehicles would get stuck, they would be able to pay East Germans to help them out. And then I think as the years went by, there was a little more of a compulsion. But the East Germans did not like the Soviets. I mean, they both from the military and the civilian standpoint. So and from a standpoint, if they looked at anybody as kind of they were more friendly to the U.S. side of the house than they were to the Soviet, but they had their families and their own lives to worry about, so that kind of impacted the way that they worked with the USMLMs.
Okay. To your knowledge, what were there instances, were there occasions where Soviet, I'm going to assume troops wouldn't do it, but officers, or how often did Soviet military personnel, when they would see a U.S. MLM vehicle pull up, would go up and talk to one of our people?
I would say that it was very rare, because the Soviets did have a very strict protocol, and it appeared that the Soviet forces were very well versed on the Huebner-Malinin Agreement, what the requirements are. And so the Soviets had what was referred to as the Kommandantura which was the head MP, as we would say, in every sector. And so he was the only person that was really able to communicate directly with the tour. So if there was a detention, the Soviets who detained them were really restricted from having any communication with them until the Kommandantura. So on a personal level, they may have wanted to, but what we saw in the field was there wasn't. Now, at the liaison element between the Soviets and the U.S., there was good, cordial conversation between, they would meet, they would get their business out of the way, do their admonitions, and then they would talk about what they're going to do during their next volleyball game, type of thing.
Okay.
Which
all right,
Soviets
here's a question from the audience. What can the Brits and French relate about their SMLMs use? What use was made of the Czech Freeport and Hamburg by SMLM?
I don't think I can. I don't think I can answer that question. I'm sorry.
Okay.
That's in the British sector, so I'm not.
Okay. Okay, I understand. Okay, so we have a member of the audience here saying, great lecture. What's the name of your book? When will it be out?
Okay, well, the book is out. It's called The Cold War Wilderness of Mirrors, the U.S. Counterintelligence and the U.S. and Soviet Military Liaison Mission 1947 to 1990. It's available on Amazon and everywhere books are sold. And like I said, so what we talked about today was roughly the first third of the book before we get into the actual, for those of us who are involved or interested in the intelligence, counterintelligence, disinformation, the international intrigue side of the house. And so, perhaps we can have that conversation next sometime.
Okay, this is our last question. Anything about East Berlin? Anything of interest or note that comes to mind?
About East Berlin in general, just that it was
And
a pretty,
no, and the MLMs.
just it was a pretty repressive, restrictive areas. East Berlin is well. I mean, they did not socialize in East Berlin. I mean, the only time they went into East Berlin was to do tours and do their collection missions. Otherwise, unless they were going to the Soviet group of forces, they didn't do anything as far as getting out and around the populace. Now, the Soviet MLMs, on the other hand, they went out and mingled within Frankfurt and other places. But no, as far as the U.S. were concerned, the only time they went into East Berlin or East Germany was strictly to do tour intelligence collection missions, and they were, kind of mission on that way.
Okay. All right. Very well. We received another question. Actually, two more, and if you're so inclined, we'll move forward.
Okay. I think I'm 4 for 5. So
okay. Here's the question. At the end of your book, you seem to indicate that USMLM had more accurate troop numbers than those official estimates. They underreported by 50%. Can you comment on this?
yeah, so this, and I should mention this as what were one of the kind of the successes of the USMLM. So historically, traditionally, the Defense Intelligence Agency and the intel community had always kind of war gamed, did correlation of forces between U.S. forces and the Soviets, estimating that they were at 100%, because that's what the Soviet forces were always reporting, was that they were at 100%. So about 1979 timeframe, USMLM started to really bring into question, whether that was correct, and they started reporting on the lower troop strengths and falsifying reports and things like this. And of course, there's kind of a institutional inertia that doesn't like hearing that, what they've been doing for the last 30 years may not be correct. But finally, by 1989, the National Intelligence Estimate did finally conclude that the Soviet forces in Germany and throughout the Central Front were over-reporting their troop strengths, and some were as low as 50 to 55% strength in actuality. And a lot, we see this all over in all the communist armies is, officers like to misreport their troop strength, and then they'll take paychecks for those empty billets.
Right. Okay. Who are the 2 Army members who volunteered in the 70s?
Oh, those are not, are you talking about the 2 members that walked into the
That's
SMLMs?
all the question says. I would assume that's the question.
Yeah, both of those were unidentified. Now that they were reported, the individual that reported, he was a GRU officer operating out of I think it was Vienna, and he just kind of tangentially heard about these stories when he was there working out of that residency. So, but the point is, he heard about these 2 incidents that took place during his 4 years. So to think that those were the only 2 incidents that took place during those 4 years, or particularly during the 40 years, would be kind of odd. So you would think that if they were accepting walk-ins for intelligence and espionage during those 4 years, that they would have done that. But he did not provide any information to identify specifically who that officer and who that NCO was. And again, he reported this probably 4, 5, 6 years after the fact.
Right. Okay. This is our last question. When the U.S. started placing sensors in the GDR, was USMLM involved?
I think that I would not feel comfortable answering that question. I do think that my book does refer to a certain agency asking them to drop rocks, specially configured rocks and sticks throughout the sector from time to time, but I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry.
I understand. In fact, with the entire nature of the briefing in your world, we all certainly understand. Okay, Mr. Magee, that basically wraps it up. Is there anything else you would like to say to conclude? before
No,
we
I
wrap
just
it
hope
up?
that it was informative. Appreciate everybody coming on. I appreciate the attention. So and certainly through Bruce, give me any feedback or that you'd like, or if there's a conversation that you would like to continue to have, Bruce can get you in touch with.
Well, thank you, sir, very much. I certainly enjoyed your presentation, and I'm absolutely certain that those in attendance tonight did as well. We wish you the best of success with your book and certainly invite you back anytime. So to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you for participating, and we certainly hope that you join us again. And to all, have a good evening.